Good evening. We start here tonight with candidates for some of the top jobs in our judiciary being quizzed today by the Judicial Services Commission. Some of the issues that were being dealt with, the length of time it takes for a judge or a presiding officer to draft judgments, the quality of those judgments, and the application and analysis of legal principles. And then, of course, the handling of cases involving minors, people under the age of 18. Tumaole Mohlaoli is there. He joins us now. Tumaole, good afternoon to you. We all know how important these interviews are. What have been the main issues today?
Well, Stephen, the main issues, of course, being the issue of how these judges and, of course, the candidates before the JSC have handled themselves in the execution of their duties, how they've managed the processes in terms of the court role in their particular courts, and how they've applied their understanding of the law, whether correct or erroneous, in terms of some of the judgments that they've passed. Now, the morning started with the Northwest Division of the High Court, and that was for the position of Deputy Judge President. And of course, one candidate there, and that was Judge J.T. Jaje, who was, of course, the one that's going to be recommended. And we know that the appointment of the judges happens at the pleasure of the President. The JSC then recommends a candidate. The candidate's name is taken to the Presidency, and then, of course, the President applies his mind, and that's how the process goes. So Judge Jaje, who was the sole candidate for that particular Deputy Judge President position, was, of course, given the nod after the interview. When it comes to the Northwest Division of the High Court, and this is something that happened earlier. We had those candidates that came through. That was 3 candidates. Now, earlier, I had erroneously said that Ms. C.K.S. Machiche was appointed or recommended for the position. That was not exactly correct, because there was no candidate that was reported or that was given the nod for that particular post. So that speaks a lot about perhaps the kind of interviews that went ahead. But to get more about this, I'm joined by Mbegezeli Benjamin, and of course he's with Judges Matter, the advocacy group for the judiciary. Mbegezeli, when one looks at the type of questioning that was given to the candidates today, what would you say was the aim, or what was trying to be gained out of the understanding or the qualifications, if one might say, of the candidates?
Well, the line of questioning that the JSC was following today, and I'd say for the past week, is one that I think has been thorough. It has been fair. The candidates were asked about their judicial experience, their knowledge of the law, their ability to discharge the very important job of a judge. And that's essentially what the questions are trying to figure out. They're trying to find out whether, based on your experience, whether you are a magistrate, an attorney, a law professor, or even an advocate, are you able to do the job, a very difficult job of a judge of the High Court? And that's what the questions are trying to get at. A lot of the candidates have been able to give quite impressive answers to some of those questions, but of course there are some that have not been able to give such strong answers.
Very, very difficult in terms of the application and the analysis of what the legal process is meant to be about. Would you say that these interviews, well, from a layman's perspective, from my perspective, seem a little bit smoother than perhaps the interviews we saw earlier last week for the Apex Court of the Land? Is that a fair assessment, or do you think that perhaps from the layman's side it's not a fair assessment at all from my side?
Well, it is a spot-on assessment, Tumaole. The JSC interviews that we've seen over the last week, including today, have been the most impressive that I've seen this year at least, and perhaps going back a couple of years. The questions have been, like I said, focused, they've been fair, they've been thorough. There hasn't been a question where I felt was particularly unfair on the candidates, because that has often been something that has in the past dominated the interviews, where it's nothing about your experience, it's more about the political issues that are happening outside there that have really nothing to do with the judiciary. So this time around, the JSC has sort of been boring, if I can call it that. There was no drama, just a normal, typical judge's interview, which is what we expect from the JSC. So I'd say your assessment was spot on.
Well, thank you very much. But when one looks at today's proceedings, the name of one Judge Hlophe, who has been interviewing the candidates as part of the panel, how would you say he has conducted himself in terms of the interview process? I certainly would suggest that he's been very direct and even curt, even despite the fact that he knows some of the candidates personally in terms of his engagements with them. Would you say that this is a fair assessment?
His questioning has been rather tough on particularly one candidate that we've seen so far. He was quite upfront to say the candidate has flaws in her candidacy and basically put it to the JSC that candidate is not strong enough to be appointed as a judge. But of course we do know the controversy surrounding Judge Hlophe, who's facing suspension from the president. So that was also quite interesting to see. You'll note that earlier on the JSC did have a closed meeting just before the interviews for the Western Cape started. They haven't told us what the meeting was about, but it's not hard to imagine what was on that agenda. And I'm sure we'll hear later from the commissioners when they brief us about the outcomes of this interview.
Because in your view, despite this controversy and the fact that Judge Hlophe possibly faces suspension from the presidency related to some of the conduct and some of the controversy around him, would you say that he participating in this particular process cast a cloud on the process, despite, of course, him seemingly conducting himself quite I would say fairly and quite robustly in his questioning in terms of the line of the questioning. Would you say it casts a cloud, or would you say that it's something that the JSC feels he's vindicated by being here?
Well, I think the JSC is in a bit of a corner when it comes to this, because the Constitution and a number of cases from the Constitutional Court have said that the Judge President of a province is required to sit in these interviews, just as the Premier is required to be in the interviews. So unless the President had decided to suspend him, then there was nothing stopping him from attending this meeting. Of course, many people would say, well, looking at the findings of the JSC and the recommendation of suspension, maybe it might have been a good idea for him to voluntarily sit it out, but I think the verdict on that is out.
Thank you very much for that analysis. That was Mbegezeli Benjamin of Judges Matter, just giving us some analysis about, of course, that particular sticking point, controversial point of Judge Hlophe's involvement in these interviews. Not to say that one is honing in and picking on the judge specifically, but it is something that has exploded onto the public domain and has been something of a debate. And of course, Mbegezeli Benjamin, as he's mentioned, that there are several considerations which, of course, would allow and permit, as Judge President of the Western Cape, Judge Hlophe, to be here, to be putting the candidates through their paces. And we will continue to bring you those candidates in terms of their performance and perhaps even lack thereof if the analysis goes that way, depending on whether they get the nod or not. And we will bring you those outcomes and developments as and when they happen. With that, it's back to you in the studio.
Tumaole Mohlaoli, thank you very much indeed for that live update from the Judicial Service Commission hearings.